Have you ever watched a film or a documentary or even just a piece of content that looked unbelievable? You were blown away by the shots, the style, the technique, but then a year later, you can't remember a single thing about it. That's because so many filmmakers think that cinematic just means how something looks. And I absolutely fell into that trap early on in my career too. But what I learned is that cinematic is actually about making your audience feel something that lasts. So in this video, I want to break down the techniques I use to make my documentaries feel more cinematic and the biggest mistake filmmakers make when they chase style over substance. So cinematic is arguably the most overused word in filmmaking, where everyone says they want it and almost no one explains what it really means. I think if you asked 100 filmmakers, you'd probably get 100 different answers about what cinematic is. But my personal definition is that at its core, cinematic just means using the tools of cinema to elevate the emotional and aesthetic impact of your story. And there's actually a really good video that another YouTuber released on this exact point a couple of weeks ago that I'll link here, where he says that cinematic is about pulling the audience into the story, not just impressing them with how something looks. And I think that's exactly right. So it's not about what any specific shot or sequence looks like, as there's so many contradicting examples of shots being cinematic and then another shot doing the exact opposite of that and also being cinematic. So it's all quite subjective. But instead, I think it's about whether the choices you make deepen the audience's experience of watching that film. And for me, that probably comes down to three things that I think you should always do or think about. The first one of those is be subjective. So make the audience feel like they're inside that character's world or inside their head and make it as immersive as you possibly can. Then the second thing is to be intentional. So every filmmaking choice should have a reason. The lens, the lighting, the grade, they all should elevate the story, the theme, the emotion, and have a purpose for being chosen. And lastly, take us on a journey. Cinematic films guide us through arcs. So the pacing, the emotional shifts, the transformation by the end, it's not just a sequence of events, it's an actual experience. And I think the really lovely thing about filmmaking is that you've got so many tools available to you that other art forms don't. So you have time, sound, music, editing, symbolism, imagery, the way one shot connects to the next. All of those are part of what makes something feel cinematic. And that's all well and good, but I would be asking now, well, how do you actually apply any of that? And for me, it probably starts with the foundation of everything, which is the story. If your story isn't working, nothing else will save it. Even in the smallest fly on the wall scene, you need to be giving your audience a beginning, a middle, and an end, and be thinking about tension, release, setting up stakes or conflict, then resolving them. And that rhythm is what will keep people watching and keep people invested in the story. And above all, build momentum. So don't just present events in an order, because it'll just end up feeling flat no matter how beautiful your cinematography is. You need to give it shape and you need to guide us through the emotional escalation and pay that off in the end. And then once you've found the shape of that story, the cinematography can then become the language you use to express it. So this is where I think so many filmmakers kind of get hung up, and they think that cinematic means they need to buy a better camera or get the absolute perfect lighting. And I don't think it does at all. For me, when I approach any new project, the cinematography is more about a set of rules I prescribe to the project, which are always based on the themes or characters. So you've got a lot of choices to make, whether you go handheld, gimbal, locked off on a tripod, do you go for a clean look that's quite digital or a really analog, gritty, textural look? Do you use hard or soft lighting? And I try to make all of these choices very intentionally and consistently so that the overall film has a language that enhances the themes and the story I'm trying to tell. So, for example, in the documentary I made on three of the strongest women in the world, we chose to shoot all of the home life footage on locked off tripod shots held for long periods of time so that we could really immerse the audience in what their day-to-day lives feel like. And each shot kind of became almost like a postcard looking into their worlds. But in contrast, when we were in the competition sections, we went for a handheld, fast-paced documentary style because we really wanted the audience to feel immersed in that action and that moment and as if they were in those competitions themselves. And I really can't emphasize enough how important that intentionality is for me, because it's probably the most frustrating thing I see, where filmmakers just throw cool shots or techniques into projects that have no relevance whatsoever to the story or connection to it or to the theme. And all it ends up doing is actually pulling me out of the film because I'm thinking about that cool shot or how good something looks, rather than connecting with what's happening itself and engaging in the film and its story. And that's what ends up making a project forgettable that a year later. So interviews is another place where I think documentaries often fall flat or become like a little too plain, because I see so many films where the interviews are just treated as exposition machines and shot in the same kind of two camera setup and standard lighting. But I always try to approach interviews as scenes in their own right. So I look at the location choice. How does it best represent the subject? That choice in that environment can tell us something immediately about the person we're seeing subconsciously to the audience. And then with the cinematography, things like the framing and the angles can also be used to carry subtext. So having an interview done at a low angle can make someone feel authoritative, or a close crop in on their face can make them feel vulnerable. Looking down the lens can feel more intimate and personal, whilst having them look off to the side can feel maybe almost confessional and like we're sitting in on a very private conversation that they're having. So, for example, in the short doc I did on the British sculptor Rufus Martin, we shot the interview completely off the cuff in his living room with him just sat on his sofa very casually, because I wanted you to feel like you were just sitting in on a conversation he was having with a friend there that day. Not set up at all, so all handheld, no lighting, with the camera moving closer and further away depending on what he was talking about, almost as if the audience was leaning in themselves at important moments. Then I also always try to get other details during interviews, so things like hands, little reactions, the space and environment around them, looks into the distance, because those details can sometimes say more than the dialogue itself. But then beyond the interviews and the kind of more traditional B-roll scenes and verite scenes that are in most documentaries, there's one other element that I always try to shoot and infuse into my work to really give it that last bit of cinematic quality. I always try and think about planned scenes or sequences that can act almost like metaphors for the character or the theme or the story that we're telling. And this isn't something revolutionary or new, and there's plenty of documentaries that have done this using more cinematic versions of existing scenes that they've gone back and shot for this exact purpose. But I just try and push it one step further. So these scenes could be symbolic or thematic or just emotionally evocative. They could be more literal, but just shot in a more poetic way. Or they could be fully abstract scenes that let the audience really feel something beyond what's being said. For example, in the short doc I made called Unconditional, the contributor Will talked about the time period he spent going through depression. And we created this large black void that he would wander around in to try and make the audience get a more visceral sense of what that time period might have felt like for him. But all of those choices, the story, the visuals, the interview, the set pieces, they really only come alive once you hit the edit. So I actually started my career mainly in editing. So I might be a little biased here, but I do fully think that editing plays the biggest part in making documentaries feel more cinematic, because it's really where you can sculpt the entire emotional experience. And there's a few key tools that you have to work with when you're doing this. You've got rhythm and pacing, so knowing when to hold on a pause for a more emotional moment or when to cut fast for tension or drama. You've got sound design and music, which can completely transform how a moment feels. Your music selection can guide the audience emotionally, or conversely, using no music and just intense or delicate sound design can also have an enormous impact at the right moment in the film. And then you've got probably the biggest one, which is metaphor and symbolism. So the ability to take one shot and recontextualize it and make it carry new meaning. And there's so many times when I've done this in my films where I've used a look off into the distance from a B-roll clip from a completely different scene or moment, but then I put it some way in the edit where it carries a whole new emotional meaning or depth. Or I've used an entire sequence of B-roll over a section of the interview so that it becomes more symbolic of what that person is talking about rather than literal. So I think if you take away one thing from this video, it's probably that cinematic documentaries aren't about how they look. They're really about how you make people feel. So be subjective, be intentional, and take us on a journey. Build your foundation in the story, then use cinematography, interviews, set pieces, and editing as tools to deepen that. And if every choice connects back to emotion and theme, your documentary will end up feeling cinematic, irrespective of the camera or lens you shoot on. And of course, a lot of this involves a lot of planning and foresight. But in a video from a few weeks ago, I also talk about how too much planning or not allowing yourself to be in the moment on set and be creatively spontaneous can actually mean sometimes you miss those incredibly cinematic moments during a shoot. So go have a watch of that.